Welcome in, everyone. Today, we're driving deep into Vladivostok.
It's a city, a city that often gets labeled, maybe unfairly, as just this far-off
Yeah,
outpost.
it's just a dot on the map, right?
Exactly. But we're going to uncover, hopefully, some of the complexity of this
We
place.
got some excerpts, by the way, from the Russian Wikipedia page on Vladivostok's history to help us with this.
And let me tell you, some of the stuff in there is really eye-opening. It challenges the what we think we know about the city.
Okay, so before we even get to what we think we know, set the scene for us. Before Russia shows up, what's going on in this part of the world?
Well, it's not like it was just empty space, right? I mean, for centuries, we're talking powerful kingdoms and empires, one after the other.
Give us some names. What are we talking? Who are the big players?
Okay, so first you've got the Bohai Kingdom. Then comes the Liao dynasty, ruled by the Khitan.
Khitans. Okay.
And then you have the Jurchens, who come in later.
See, now that's a name most people haven't encountered in their history books. Jurchens.
Right. But these were major powers, sophisticated, the whole deal. They had their own cultures, their own stories.
But this is where Vladivostok is now.
You got it. There was a Jurchen city, thriving place, right where we are now, metaphorically speaking, of course.
So what happened? How to become, Vladivostok?
Mongols.
Straightforward enough.
Yeah, 13th century, they roll through, wipe the Jurchen city, clean off the map. History's like that, isn't it? Here 1 minute, gone the next.
Makes you think what we've gotten wrong. Like, the official Russian history often talks about this region as basically untouched wilderness before they got there.
Yeah, that whole empty land idea, ripe for the taking, except not so much.
What do you mean?
We've got these accounts, right, from early Russian explorers, guys like Yerofey Khabarov, and he's describing a populous land. So not exactly the empty wilderness some folks like to make it out to be.
Already, things are getting more interesting, more complicated. Which is good. Means we're on the right track.
Absolutely. And it only gets more, shall we say, nuanced as we move into the 19th century, because that's when Russia really plants its flag in the region, and Vladivostok, as we kind of know it, that's when it's born, 1860.
Right, 1860, military outpost. But I'm curious, was this their first choice, this spot? Why here?
You've been doing your research. You're right. They spent decades, the Russians, looking for the perfect Pacific port, trade, defense, projecting power, the whole 9 yards. They needed a good spot for it.
Makes sense.
And eventually, they realized Vladivostok, with that natural harbor deep, protected. It was the golden ticket.
Prime real estate. Strategically speaking, anyway. No
Yeah.
wonder everybody wanted it.
100%. And one of the big names early on in the city's history is this guy, Yakov Semenov.
Semenov, wasn't he the first civilian to settle on Vladivostok?
That's the one. 1861, he shows up just a year after the military, and he was like a one-man chamber of commerce, buying land, building businesses.
Real go-getter type.
Totally. In fact, he becomes Vladivostok's first elected leader, so clearly people saw him as a driving force.
Sounds like he embodies that whole frontier spirit. See a need, fill a need.
And because of people like Semenov, Vladivostok, it starts to boom. It's not just a fort anymore, it's a real city, developing its own personality.
By 1900, it's a full-on boom town, right? Melting pot of cultures, from what I've read.
Oh, absolutely. You name it, they were there. Russians, Germans, Koreans, Chinese, Japanese. A real mix.
Drawn in by the promise of this new city, on the edge of, well, everything, really.
Opportunity. That's what it came down to. Late 19th, early 20th century, Vladivostok was the place to be, especially once the Trans-Siberian Railway arrived in 1903.
That's wild, thinking about that railway connecting Vladivostok all the way to Europe. Talk about changing the game.
It put Vladivostok on the map, globally speaking. Trade exploded. You had even more people coming from all over hoping to get rich.
Vladivostok sounds like it was on a roll. Unstoppable, almost.
Uh-huh.
But I'm guessing, like, even with all that growth, all that energy, it wasn't all smooth sailing, right?
You're telling me, even without, global pandemics and world wars and all that, just the normal stuff, growing that fast, there had to be some bumps in the road.
Exactly.
Plus, on top of everything else, the early 1900s, not exactly known for being, calm and peaceful, globally speaking. Vladivostok got caught up in that, too. Couldn't escape it.
Podium.
1904, Russo-Japanese War. Now, Vladivostok wasn't where most of the fighting was, but still.
Right.
Blockades, the constant threat of attack, it all took a toll, right?
Yeah.
On the city, on the people.
War does that, changes everything.
For sure. And then, as if that wasn't enough, things are just starting to recover from the war. Boom, 1905 revolution hits Russia.
Talk about a 1-2 punch.
Seriously.
Right.
Vladivostok gets hit with this wave of unrest, part of this bigger upheaval going on across the Russian Empire.
City just can't catch a break.
But here's the thing about Vladivostok, and you see this all through its history, this resilience,
Wow.
It bends, it gets knocked around, but it doesn't break. So even with the war, the revolution, it actually goes through another boom period leading right up to World War One.
It's like this city just refuses to quit. But then, World War I, 1917, the Bolsheviks start. Everything gets turned upside down again, especially in Russia.
No kidding. And Vladivostok, right in the middle of it all, becomes this kind of microcosm of the fight for power going on in Russia as a whole. The Bolsheviks take over, yeah, but it's shaky.
So even within Russia itself, different groups, different factions are all fighting for control.
100%. But Vladivostok, it gets even more complicated because on top of the internal stuff, you have foreign powers getting involved.
Oh, right. Wasn't there something about Czech soldiers being there?
The Czech legionnaires. Wild story, really. They were actually allied with Russia during World War I, but then they end up controlling parts of Vladivostok. And that's what opened the door for this much bigger international occupation of the city.
Hold on, wait. During the Russian Revolution, Vladivostok was occupied, by foreign troops? I did not know that.
Oh, yeah. It was wild. We're talking U.S., Japanese, British, even some Canadians, all hanging out in Vladivostok, each with their own agenda. It's like a history book exploded in that city.
That's incredible. It's like this one city becomes the center of the universe for a minute there, with all these global power struggles playing out.
And it shows you how, stuff happening continents away, it can have a real impact on people's lives right here, right now.
So everybody wants a piece of Vladivostok.
Pretty much. You mentioned the Japanese, and they're important because they actually stick around the longest. Even after everyone else goes home, they're still there, right through the Russian Civil War and everything.
What was their deal? Why were they so determined to stay in Vladivostok?
Well, it's all about strategy, right? They saw the Russian Revolution, all this chaos, as a chance to, let's just say, expand their influence in the area.
Opportunists.
They even backed this separate government in the Russian Far East for a while.
So it wasn't just about, being helpful neighbors or whatever.
Not exactly. Their big goal, it seems, was to create a sphere of influence for themselves, maybe even take some land.
But it didn't work. Why did they finally leave?
Few reasons. One, pressure from the U.S. The Americans weren't too keen on Japan getting any stronger. Two, even within Japan, people started questioning why they were spending all this money, all this effort on this far-off city. So by 1922, they pack up and head home.
Like pulling teeth, I bet.
Really felt that way for them. But anyway, the Japanese are gone, the Russian Civil War is over, the Soviet Union is born, and Vladivostok. Well, it's officially part of this brand new communist experiment.
And how'd that go? Were things finally looking up for Vladivostok?
Well, about that. Imagine this. Years of war, revolution, the city's a mess, the economy's in shambles, people are struggling.
Makes sense. It's a lot to recover from.
And if that wasn't bad enough, get this. As the Japanese are leaving, they didn't exactly go quietly.
Oh no, what'd they do?
The Russian Wikipedia page, it talks about how they basically looted the place on their way out, stripped it bare.
So on top of everything else, they get robbed blind. Ouch.
Yeah, talk about adding insult to injury. But on top of all that, this is when things get really different for Vladivostok, because now it's part of the Soviet Union, and that meant playing by a whole new set of rules.
The Cold War is starting up around this time too, right?
Exactly. And Vladivostok, because of its location, it becomes this vitally important naval base for the Soviets. So they designate it as a closed city.
Closed city. I've heard that term, but I'm not totally clear on what it means. What did that mean, practically speaking, for the people living there?
Think of it like this. You want to go to Vladivostok. Tough luck. Unless you've got special permission, you're not getting in. And for the people who live there, forget about, calling up your relatives in Paris or taking a vacation to Florida. Contact with the outside world was, shall we say, discouraged.
Wow. So Vladivostok goes from being this bustling international city to basically being shut off from the rest of the world.
It's a city living a double life. Outwardly, it's this crucial part of the Soviet war machine, lots of shipbuilding, military activity. And for the people living there, there's this, sense of purpose, of national pride.
Right, they're in the front lines of the Cold War. But at the same time, it's a closed city. You mentioned control. What was the less glamorous side of all this?
We've got to talk about the Gulag system, right? Because that's the dark underbelly of the Soviet Union, and tragically, Vladivostok was part of it.
The Gulag. That's the forced labor camp system, right?
Exactly. Millions of people, branded enemies of the state, shipped off to these camps, worked to death, starved, everything. Brutal, horrific system. And Vladivostok.
They had those camps there, too.
There was one in particular, the Vladivostok transit camp. It was a major hub, right? Prisoners would come through there, usually by train, on their way to other camps further east.
So for these prisoners, Vladivostok wasn't the end of the line, but it was another stop on this awful journey.
You've got it. And it reminds you, even in a place like that, strategically important, seemingly vibrant, there's always another side to the story, a darker side.
Definitely. And the Russian Wikipedia page we've been looking at, it doesn't mention the impact of Stalin's purges on Vladivostok. But those purges were widespread. Did they affect Vladivostok too?
It's almost impossible to imagine they didn't. We're talking about a period of intense paranoia, suspicion. People were arrested, executed, disappeared for the smallest perceived offense, or sometimes for no reason at all. And Vladivostok, with its naval base, its strategic importance, it would have been a prime target for that kind of crackdown.
It's like this whole other layer of darkness on top of everything else going on there. But then, in 1959, something interesting happens. Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, he visits Vladivostok.
And this is significant for a couple reasons. One, Khrushchev, he's the one who condemns Stalin, right? Starts to loosen things up a bit in the Soviet Union. So him showing up in Vladivostok, it's a big deal.
What was his impression of the city?
Well, from what I've read, he was, let's just say, not impressed. The living conditions, the housing, it was pretty bad, even by Soviet standards.
So even with all the focus on being a key naval base, the people living there were still struggling.
Yeah, the problems have been building up for decades, really. And Khrushchev, to his credit, he actually does something about it.
Like what?
He makes this promise right there in Vladivostok to improve living conditions, to invest in the city. And it wasn't just empty words. After his visit, new housing gets built, a university is founded, all these cultural institutions start popping up.
So why the sudden change of heart? Why did Khrushchev decide to invest in Vladivostok's future?
It was probably a mix of things. On the one hand, Khrushchev genuinely wanted to improve people's lives. It was part of his whole de-Stalinization thing. But on the other hand, he also knew that if you want a strong military base, you need the people who live there to be happy or at least not miserable.
So it was good for the city and good for the Soviet Union's strategic goals. A win-win, I guess.
You could say that. Khrushchev's visit, it really marked a turning point for Vladivostok. They were still a closed city, sure, but there was this new focus on, making life better for the people who live there.
It's wild to think about. Like, Vladivostok, this closed-off city, but even they couldn't totally escape what was happening in the Soviet Union as a whole. And then, of course, the Soviet Union, poof, gone.
Just like that. It's almost hard to wrap your head around a change that massive. The whole system, the whole idea that Vladivostok was built on, gone practically overnight.
And for a city that was so, defined by its role as a naval base, closed off for all those years, that must have been incredibly disorienting for the people living there.
To put it mildly, we're talking total upheaval on every level. The Russian Wikipedia page really drives this home. The defense industry, the backbone of Vladivostok's economy, it just collapses.
No more Soviet Union, no more enemy to defend against.
Exactly. So factories closed, military contracts dried up, people were out of work, no idea what the future held.
I imagine a lot of people just packed up and left, tried to find somewhere, anywhere that felt a little more stable.
That's exactly what happened. The population plummeted. Vladivostok went through this identity crisis on top of everything else.
So what did they do? How do you even begin to rebuild a city after that kind of earthquake?
Honestly, it took a lot of grit, a lot of creativity. People had to find new ways to get by, new ways to make a living. Entrepreneurship, which was, kind of frowned upon back in the Soviet days, suddenly that's what saved them.
The old rules were gone, so they had to write new ones. What were some of those new paths, the new things Vladivostok became known for?
Well, for one, they really embraced being a port city, and I mean a major one, not just for Russia, but for, the entire Pacific Rim. Global trade, that was the ticket.
So instead of warships, it's cargo ships and container ships.
Exactly. And that brought jobs, it brought investment. Plus, people started to realize, hey, Vladivostok is actually a pretty cool place to visit.
Tourism, yeah. It's like the city went from being this forbidden zone to this, undiscovered gem or something.
That's a good way to put it. And then, of course, there's the whole APEC summit thing in 2012.
Right. That was huge. For people who don't know, what's the APEC summit, and why was it such a big deal for Vladivostok?
So APEC, that's the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. Basically, it's all the biggest economies in the Pacific Rim getting together to talk trade, cooperation, all that.
So, like, a really big deal for a city trying to reinvent itself as a global player.
Exactly. Russia really wanted to use that summit to show the world, hey, Vladivostok is back, baby.
Yeah.
And they spent a ton of money getting the city ready.
Yeah, those bridges. You can't talk about modern Vladivostok without mentioning those incredible bridges.
Those bridges are like this perfect symbol of what Russia was trying to do. They're beautiful, they're impressive, they connect things. It was a statement, you know?
Vladivostok as a bridge between Russia and the East.
Exactly. But here's the thing. These big events, these big investments, they always have a flip side, you know?
What do you mean?
Well, yeah, the APEC summit brought in money. It got Vladivostok on the map, but it also shone a light on some of the problems that were already there.
Like what?
Inequality, for one. The cost of living in Vladivostok went way up in the years leading up to the summit.
Gentrification, you could call it, right?
Yeah, basically. So you had this weird situation where, like, Vladivostok is on the rise, it's modernizing, but not everyone is benefiting equally.
It's that old story, right? Progress for some often means getting left behind for others.
It's complicated, that's for sure. And it's something Vladivostok and a lot of cities in that same boat, they're still trying to figure out, you know?
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Centuries of history, empires rising and falling, war, revolution, reinvention. What's the takeaway? What's the one big thing you hope people remember about Vladivostok?
I guess if there's one thing to take away, it's that this is a city that defies expectations. It always has. You think you know what it is, what it's going to be, but then it throws you a curveball.
That's a great way to put it. And on that note, we're going to have to leave it there for today. Big thanks to our expert for, well, being an expert and for joining us on the deep dive into Vladivostok.
Anytime. Fascinating city, really.
Until next time, everybody, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep learning.
Thank you for listening. If you love history, don't forget to subscribe to History with Bree and Peter. Join us for more fascinating stories from the past. Hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode.